The first thing I was aware of was the light. Not warmth, not sound, just light, white, clinical, sourceless, pressing against the inside of my eyelids like something that had been waiting for me to come back and was impatient about it. The second thing I was aware of was the pain. Not in any specific location, everywhere. The full body, comprehensive pain of a person who has been broken and partially reassembled by people who knew what they were doing but could not promise to make it stop hurting. The third thing I was aware of was the beaking. And then, slowly, in the way consciousness returns when it has been gone for a very long time, I became aware of a man sitting in a chair beside my hospital bed, and I knew him, and I moved my eyes toward him, and he was not looking at me the way a husband looks at a wife he has been afraid he was going to lose. He was looking at me like a problem that had just become more complicated. He reached into the bag beside the chair. He placed a manila envelope on my hospital blanket. I couldn't speak. There was still a tube. I couldn't move my right arm. I could barely turn my head. But I could read the words on the label of that envelope, and the words were Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, and the date on the label was 3 days after I had been admitted to the ICU. 3 days. He had filed 3 days after the ambulance brought me in, while I was on a ventilator, while his mother, his elegant, pearl-wearing, charity circuit-attending mother, was walking through the front door of the house I had bought with my own money before I ever met either of them, and was handing the keys to a real estate agent and signing documents with my name. She thought I would die. I survived. And I made sure she spends the rest of her life in a dirty city shelter.
I need to tell you what it feels like to wake up from a coma, because I think most people imagine it the way it happens in movies. A dramatic gasp, eyes flying open, immediate coherent speech, a tearful reunion, someone squeezing your hand. It is not like that. Waking up from a coma is like being dragged through something thick and dark and resistant, something that does not want to let you out. And when you finally surface, you surface incomplete. Pieces of you return at different speeds. My eyes could open before I could move my fingers. I could feel sensation in my left hand before my right. I could understand language. I could hear the nurses talking, could register that words were words, before I could make my face respond to them. The nurses were wonderful. I want to say that clearly and first, because this is not a story about medical professionals, and they deserve their moment before I get to the people who don't. The nurses who had been caring for me for 3 weeks, 3 weeks I have no memory of, 3 weeks that exist for me only as the gap between the sound of the impact and the moment the white light pressed against my eyelids, those nurses had named me, not officially, but in the quiet language of people who spend long shifts with patients who cannot respond. They had begun calling me their fighter. I found this out later from one of them, and it meant something to me that I still can't put precisely into words. My name is Nadia Reeves. I am 34 years old. I am a licensed landscape architect who runs my own firm, Reeves Design Group, which I built from a single client referral and a maxed-out personal credit card when I was 28, and which, by the time of the accident, employed 11 people and had a project portfolio that covered 4 states. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I am not a woman who needs to be taken care of. I am a woman who takes care of things, who has always taken care of things, who built something from nothing, twice, the firm and the house, with her own hands and her own money and her own relentless, unreasonable refusal to accept that the thing she was building might not work. The house, my house, was a craftsman bungalow on Aldrich Avenue that I had purchased at 29, before I met my husband, before his mother ever set foot in my life. I had restored it for 2 years, much of the work done by contractors I managed myself, because I understood construction documents and could read a structural report, and was not someone that a general contractor could reasonably attempt to mislead. I had stripped the original woodwork and refinished it. I had replaced the kitchen while keeping the original built-in cabinetry that had made me fall in love with the house in the first place. I had paid off the mortgage in 4 years. The house was mine, fully, legally, premarital asset, documented thoroughly, held in my name alone. I need you to hold that too. My husband's name is Garrett Reeves. He took my name when we married because he said he admired what I'd built and wanted to be part of it, which at the time struck me as romantic, and which I now understand was the first indication that he was interested in my assets in ways I hadn't examined closely enough. We had been married for 3 years when the accident happened. The accident itself, a delivery truck running a red light at full speed and striking the driver's side of my car, lasted less than 2 seconds. I know this because the intersection had a traffic camera, and the footage was eventually obtained by my attorney, and the 2 seconds are visible, stark and exact on the recording. Before, I am driving. After, the car is no longer recognizable as a car. My injuries were extensive: fractured pelvis, fractured right femur, 6 broken ribs, 2 of which had punctured my right lung, a traumatic brain injury, moderate to severe, which explained the coma and the 3 weeks of darkness and the pieces returning at different speeds that I described earlier. The neurosurgeon told me later that I had been, in the clinical language he used, touch and go for the first 72 hours. During those 72 hours, my husband had filed for divorce. During those 3 weeks, while I could not speak, or move, or object, or sign, or refuse, his mother had sold my house. I didn't know any of this when I woke up. I only knew the light, and the pain, and Garrett in the chair with his particular expression, and the manila envelope on my hospital blanket. He didn't hand it to me with ceremony, he just placed it there, the way you place a bill on a counter, with the implication that this is routine, that this is simply the next step in a process, that both parties understand what this is. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I had a tube in my throat and could not speak, so I did the only thing I could do, which was look at him with every question I had never talked to ask, and wait to see if his face answered any of them. His face answered all of them. He was wearing his good wool coat, the charcoal one I had bought him for his 36th birthday, from the tailor downtown who knew his measurements. He was clean-shaven, his hair was combed. He did not look like a man who had spent the last 3 weeks keeping vigil at a hospital bedside. He looked like a man who had spent the last 3 weeks making arrangements. I reached out my left hand, my functioning hand, and I touched the envelope. He said, "The nurse says you're getting the tube out tomorrow. When you can talk, we should discuss things." He said "discuss things" in the voice of a man describing a business meeting. He stood up, he straightened his coat, he picked up his bag. He said, "I'm glad you're awake, Nadia," and he walked out. I lay there in the white room with the beeping and the hiss of the ventilator and the manila envelope on my chest, and I thought about the way he said "glad." Not relieved, not thank God, not any word that contained the specific quality of having been afraid of losing something you love. Glad, the way you're glad when a delayed flight finally boards. The tube came out the next morning. My first words, the first words I spoke after 3 weeks of silence, with a throat that felt like it had been scoured with sandpaper, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, were to the nurse who removed it, and the words were, "Can I make a phone call?" She looked at me with the expression of someone who has seen a lot of things and is adding this to the list. She handed me the bedside phone. I called my business partner, Delia. I didn't call Garrett. I didn't call his mother, because in the 22 hours between Garrett's departure and the tube's removal, lying in the white room with the manila envelope on my chest and nothing to do but think, I had begun to understand that whatever was coming, it would be survived by reacting. It would be survived by thinking. And I had always been very, very good at thinking. But I still didn't know about the house. That discovery would come 48 hours later, in the rain, in front of a door that my key wouldn't open. And it would be the moment that everything I thought I knew about my life collapsed completely. The hospital discharged me 18 days after I woke up. 18 days of physical therapy and neurological assessments and a parade of specialists. The orthopedic surgeon, the pulmonologist, the neuropsychologist who tested my cognitive function with a series of exercises that I found insulting, and then when I failed 3 of them on the first attempt, terrifying. My brain, she explained, was healing. The pathways were rerouting. I would likely regain full function or close to it, but the timeline was not something she could specify precisely, and I should be patient with myself. I am not, historically, patient with myself. I was walking, with a cane, badly, the right leg not yet reliable, by day 9. I was reading and reviewing documents by day 11. By day 14, I had asked Delia to bring me my laptop and conducted 2 client check-ins by video call from my hospital bed, which the nursing staff considered unadvisable and which I considered non-negotiable. Garrett visited twice in 18 days. The first visit was the one I described, the coat, the bag, the manila envelope, the Glad. The second visit was on day 6, brief, during which he sat in the chair again and spoke about the divorce proceedings in the tone of a man reporting on a project status update, and I listened to him without expression and asked no questions and gave no reactions, and after about 12 minutes he became visibly uncomfortable with my stillness and stood up and said he'd be in touch through his attorney. I said, "Okay." He looked at me for a moment. He left. I had not yet hired my own attorney. I was still, in those first 2 weeks, operating on the assumption that the divorce, catastrophic and cruel, and timed in a way that revealed more about Garrett's character than years of marriage had, was the main event, the primary wound, the thing I needed to address and survive. I did not yet know that the house was gone. The day I was discharged, the weather was what I call real October weather, not the picturesque kind, with amber leaves and the smell of wood smoke, but the functional, relentless, grey and wet kind that Minneapolis does when it's decided that summer is finished and wants you to know it personally. The rain was the horizontal variety, the kind that umbrellas fail to contain, that finds the collar gap of your jacket and runs a cold finger down the back of your neck. I took a cab. Delia had offered to drive me. She had, in fact, offered extensively. Delia is a woman who expresses love through logistics, but I needed to do this part alone. I needed to arrive at my house alone, with my key, and stand in my own doorway and close the door behind me on the hospital and the white room and Garrett's expression and the manila envelope. I needed to put my hands on the walls of the house I had restored with my own plans and my own decisions, and stand in it and let it be the thing that I knew was mine. I had my key on the ring in my jacket pocket. I could feel it through the fabric the entire ride, a specific physical comfort, the weight of it, the particular shape of the craftsman's head that the locksmith had copied from the original hardware when I'd had the locks rekeyed. The cab pulled up. I got out. I stood on the sidewalk in the rain with my cane and my hospital discharge bag, and I looked at my house. There was a lamp on inside. In the living room, my living room, a floor lamp, not mine, a different style, something with a white shade and a brass finish that I had not chosen and would not have chosen, was on inside my living room. I thought, Garrett has been staying here. I thought, of course, he lives here. It's a marital home, even if it's premarital in terms of ownership. He's been here. I walked to the front door. I put the key in the lock. The key did not turn. I pulled it out. I looked at it. Same key, same lock, same hardware, same craftsman escutcheon I'd sourced from a salvage dealer in Wisconsin. I put the key back in. It did not turn. I tried again, and again. I tried it the way you try a key that's being temperamental, slightly lifted, slightly angled, the micro-adjustments of someone who knows a particular lock's quirks. The lock did not respond. I stood there for a moment, rain in my collar, cane wet, not yet understanding. Then the door opened from the inside. A woman, mid-40s, pleasant-looking, wearing an apron that had flour on it, clearly in the middle of something domestic, opened the door and looked at me with the polite, slightly guarded expression of a person confronted on their doorstep. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I'm sorry, I think there's some confusion. This is my house." The woman's expression shifted. She said, "This is our house. We've lived here since September." September. The accident had been in August. "We purchased it in September," she said, more carefully now, in the way people speak when they begin to sense that a conversation is going to require more care than they had allocated for it. The closing was the first week of September. I heard the words. I processed them. I said, "I need to call someone." She looked at me, at my cane, my hospital pallor, the rain on my jacket, and something in her face shifted from wariness to concern. She said, "Do you want to come in out of the rain while you do that?" I said, "No." I stepped back from the door. I called 911. Not because I thought the police could fix this immediately, but because I understood standing on that wet sidewalk in the rain that what had happened, whatever had happened, the full shape of which I still did not entirely understand, needed to be documented, needed to be on the record from this moment with a timestamp and a case number and a uniformed officer writing things down. I had always been very good at thinking. An officer arrived. He was young, he was professional. He listened to me explain in the flat, precise voice of someone managing themselves very carefully that I was the owner of this property, that I had been in a coma for 3 weeks following a vehicular accident, and that I had just been told by the current occupants that the house had been sold in September while I was hospitalized. He took notes. He spoke to the current occupants, the woman and her husband, who came to the door together now, who showed him a purchase agreement, a closing statement, a deed. My name was on the deed. My signature was on the closing documents. I had not signed them. I stood there in the rain and looked at my signature on a document I had never seen before, and something went very cold inside me. Not grief, not panic, but the specific chill of a person who is beginning to understand the actual scale of what has been done to them. And I thought, whoever did this believed that I was never going to be standing here to see it. They believed I was going to die. I hadn't, and now I needed to find out exactly who signed my name. The police officer was sympathetic and largely helpless, which is not a criticism. The situation was outside of the scope of what a patrol officer's tools could address in a parking lot in the rain, and he knew it and said so honestly. He gave me a case number. He told me to contact the fraud division. He gave me the card of a detective in that unit. He also, quietly, and not as part of his official guidance, told me to call a lawyer tonight. I thanked him. I called another cab. I did not call Delia. I did not call anyone I knew. I sat in the back of the cab as it moved through the wet streets, and I did what I always do when I am confronted with a problem that is larger than my immediate capacity to solve it. I broke it into pieces. What did I know? My house had sold in September while I was in a coma. The sale appeared to have been conducted with my signature on the closing documents. I had not signed anything in September because I had been unconscious since August. Therefore, either my signature had been forged or someone had operated under a legal instrument, a power of attorney most likely, that granted them the authority to sign on my behalf. I had never signed a power of attorney for anyone. I had never authorized anyone to act on my behalf in property transactions, which meant either one had been forged or, and this was the thought I held at arm's length in the cab because looking at it directly was too much for the moment, Garrett had somehow produced one. I asked the cab driver to take me to the nearest library with evening hours instead of any residential destination. He gave me a look in the rearview mirror that I didn't have the energy to interpret and made the turn. Reflective. The library was warm and fluorescent and quiet, the way libraries are in the early evening. A few students, an elderly man with newspapers, a librarian shelving returns with practiced efficiency. I found a computer terminal, and I sat down, cane against the table, hospital discharge bag on the floor, and I began. Analytical. I started with the County Recorder's Office property records, which are public and accessible online. I pulled up the address on Aldrich Avenue. I pulled the most recent transaction. The deed of sale was dated September 4th. The grantor, the seller, was listed as Nadia Reeves. The instrument that authorized the transaction was listed as Power of Attorney, executed August 14th, recorded August 19th. August 14th was the day after my accident. August 19th was day 6 of my coma. Analytical. The attorney in fact listed on the power of attorney, the person who had been granted the legal authority to act on my behalf, was listed as Renata Louise Clifford, my mother-in-law. Calm. Her name is Renata Louise Clifford. Analytical. She had never taken Garrett's father's name. She was that kind of woman, a woman who kept her own name and used the keeping of it as evidence of an independence she did not otherwise demonstrate, because the independence she claimed was performative, and the dependence she enacted was financial and social and complete. Measured. She was 62 years old. She had lived at the time, in a 2-bedroom apartment in Edina, in a building that was respectable and slightly beyond her means, and that she maintained, I had always understood, partially with Garrett's financial assistance, and partially with the residue of a settlement from her divorce with Garrett's father, which had occurred 20 years ago, and which she referenced in conversation with the frequency of someone for whom it was still the most important thing that had ever happened. She wore pearls, real ones, a strand she'd received as a wedding gift and never stopped wearing, in the way some women carry an inheritance as armor. She had opinions about everything, delivered in the particular cadence of someone who expects agreement, and she had opinions about me specifically that she had never fully concealed. I was too independent, too focused on work, too disinclined to perform the specific variety of deference that she had decided constituted respect. She had wanted Garrett to marry someone more malleable. She had gotten me instead, and she had spent 3 years managing her disappointment with varying degrees of gracelessness. Firm, I had never liked her. I had never trusted her. Cold, but I had never imagined this. Pause. Focused. I dug deeper. The power of attorney had been notarized by a man named Gerald Portman. I looked up Gerald Portman. He was a notary public licensed in Hennepin County. He had a business address that turned out to be a UPS store in Bloomington. I noted this. Analytical. I searched his name in conjunction with the state notary database. His license was current, no disciplinary record. I searched his name in another context, one that required me to navigate several databases that are technically public but not easily accessible without knowing where to look. I found a connection, small, indirect, but present, between Gerald Portman and a name in Renata Clifford's social circle, visible through a charity gala guest list from 2 years prior, where both names appeared. A charity that Renata chaired a committee for, a charity that Garrett had donated to, at her mother's request, the previous Christmas. Cold. The corrupt notary was not a stranger. He was a connection, a favor, a transaction. Measured. I sat back in the library chair. The sale price for my house, my fully paid-off, premarital, personally restored craftsman bungalow on Aldrich Avenue, was $450,000. Analytical. The house had sold in 4 days, listed and closed in 4 days, which was extraordinary, and which indicated a buyer who had been identified before the house was listed, which indicated that this sale had been arranged before the listing, possibly before the accident, possibly in anticipation of a circumstance in which I would not be in a position to object. Firm. $450,000. Intense, from a house that was mine, in a transaction signed with my forged name, authorized by a document signed by a notary who knew the person who was using it. Cold, while I was on a ventilator. Pause. Reflective. I thought about Garrett's second hospital visit, his project status voice, his "I'll be in touch through my attorney." Cold. I thought about the divorce filing dated 3 days after my admission. I thought about a man who files for divorce 3 days after his wife goes into a coma, and whose mother, in the weeks following, converts her primary asset into $450,000 in cash. I thought about what that planning would look like. I thought about when it would have started. Analytical. And then I thought about something the police officer had said almost in passing as he gave me his card in the rain. He had said, "The deed shows a wire transfer to a private account. Do you have any accounts with a routing number that ends in 4471? I had said no. He had nodded and written something down. Focused. I typed the partial routing number into a banking institution lookup tool. It returned a result, a private credit union based in Edina, Minnesota. Measured. The same city where Renata Clifford lived. Cold. Or, I corrected myself, updating the mental file in real time, where Renata Clifford had lived. Dark. Because $450,000 buys a very nice condo if you're not concerned where the money came from. Firm. I needed to find out exactly where she was living now. Intense, and I needed to do it before she knew that I was looking. The motel was called the Parkway Inn, which was neither near a park nor in any sense an inn, but which cost $58 a night and had a vending machine down the hall that sold instant oatmeal packets at 3 in the morning, which turned out to be important information. I stayed there for 6 weeks. I want you to understand what that was, because the word motel doesn't fully convey it. The carpet was a pattern that had stopped being identifiable as a pattern sometime in the previous decade. The window faced the parking lot, and the parking lot's lights were the kind that hum, a specific frequency, low and constant, that you stop consciously hearing after a few days, but that lives in your sleep. The shower ran either cold or scalding, with a brief and unpredictable window of something in between. There was a dresser with a handle missing on the second drawer. I ate oatmeal and diner food and whatever Delia brought me in Tupperware containers she left at the front desk, because I had asked her not to visit, not yet, because I needed everyone who might report back to Garrett or his mother to believe that I was broken. Broken and lost and overwhelmed, and not a threat. I was none of these things. I had been raised by a woman who taught me that the most dangerous position you can put an enemy in is one where they believe they have already won. My mother called it playing possum, though she meant it in the literal wildlife sense, a survival strategy, not a revenge one. I had adapted the concept. Garrett knew I had discovered the house situation. The officer's visit was a matter of record, and Garrett's attorney would have advised him of it. What Garrett did not know was the depth of what I had found at the library. He did not know about Gerald Portman. He did not know about the routing number. He did not know that I had, in the 48 hours since leaving the library, filed a formal complaint with the County Fraud Division and provided them with the documentation I had copied and photographed from the public records. What Garrett did know, through the performance I was very carefully staging, was that his wife had been discharged from the hospital, had discovered her house was sold, was apparently staying in a motel, and was, based on the one text I sent him, carefully worded, trying to figure out what to do. Trying to figure out what to do is the language of someone who is overwhelmed. I was not overwhelmed. I was organizing. On day 4 of the motel, my phone rang. The number was Renata's. I want to describe the particular sensation of watching that name appear on your screen when you know what you know, when you have sat with the routing number and the notary and the 4-day sale and the $450,000 wire transfer and have assembled them into a shape that is impossible to look at directly without a specific kind of cold fury taking up residence in your chest. There is an urge to answer immediately and say everything. The urge is powerful and entirely wrong, and I waited for it to pass the way you wait for a wave, knowing it will, knowing you will still be standing when it does. I answered on the 4th ring. "Renata," I said. Her voice was warm. The warmth was the warmth of a woman who has calculated that warmth is the correct temperature for this moment, not genuine warmth, but professional warmth. The kind deployed by people who have spent a lifetime managing others' perceptions. Disgusted. "Nadia, sweetheart, I heard you were discharged. I've been so worried." "Sweetheart." "I'm managing," I said. I made my voice small. I am not a small-voiced person. My natural register is clear and carrying, a voice trained by years of project site meetings where I needed to be heard over construction equipment. But I can make it small when I need to. It's been a lot to process. Of course it has, sweetheart. And I want you to know what happened with the house. It was a complicated situation, Nadia. There were financial pressures you didn't know about. Garrett had to make some difficult decisions while you were... She paused, and in the pause I heard her recalibrating. "While you were recovering," she finished. I want to note for the record what she just said. She said Garrett had to make difficult decisions. Not, there was a forged power of attorney. Not, I liquidated your premarital asset without your knowledge or consent. Not, I took $450,000 from a woman who was on a ventilator. She said Garrett had to make difficult decisions. implicating him in the same breath as she positioned the entire transaction as a necessary, if unfortunate, response to circumstances. She was in real time, on a phone call she believed was a safe space to manage me, constructing the narrative that she would use if anyone ever looked too closely. And she was constructing it sloppily, with the confidence of someone who has decided that the person on the other end of the line is not going to look too closely. I made my voice smaller. I just don't understand all the legal stuff. It's so overwhelming. Of course it is, sweetheart. And then, this is the part that I have replayed in my memory with a frequency that suggests I am not yet entirely done being astounded by it. She said, "You should really focus on your recovery. The financial things, the house, all of that, it will sort itself out. You need to focus on getting better, getting your health back." Getting my health back, as if the house were a separate, unrelated matter, as if sort itself out had meaning when applied to fraud. "Where are you staying?" she asked. I named the motel. There was a pause, and in the pause I heard what I was meant to hear, the slight adjustment of someone recalibrating their opinion of the situation, the very faint satisfaction of a woman who has moved into a luxury condo and is now hearing that the woman she displaced is staying at the Parkway Inn for $58 a night. "Oh," she said. "Well, anything we can do to help." Help. She offered to help. I said, "Thank you, Renata. I'll be in touch." I ended the call. I looked at the water stain on the motel ceiling for a long moment. Then I picked up the phone and called the attorney Delia had researched for me, the one whose name I had written in the library on a scrap of paper I'd been carrying in my discharge bag. Margaret Okonkwo, Okonkwo & Associates, fraud, asset recovery, civil litigation. The receptionist told me Ms. Okonkwo had an opening the following Wednesday. I said, "I need something sooner. I'll explain when we speak, but this involves forged instruments, a fraudulent notary, and approximately $450,000 in illegally transferred assets. I can provide documentation." There was a pause. The receptionist said, "Can you come tomorrow at 8? I said yes. "But I want to tell you one more thing about that night. After Renata's call, after I booked the appointment with Margaret Okonkwo, after the oatmeal and the parking lot hum and the HVAC keeping its particular rhythm, I lay on the motel bed with my cane beside me and my phone on my chest, and I thought about Renata in her new condo, bought with the money from my house, wearing her pearl necklace in the rooms she had furnished with my $450,000. I thought about her voice saying, "Sort itself out." I thought, "You have made a serious mistake. You made a serious mistake the moment you decided that surviving was going to be a problem for me rather than a problem for you." And I thought, I am going to give you exactly enough time to believe you've won. And then I am going to take everything.
Margaret Okonkwo was not what I had expected from her reputation, which I realize is exactly what she intended. She was 51 years old. She wore a blazer the color of slate and glasses with narrow rectangular frames, and kept her desk with the specific organization of someone who treats disorder as a professional liability. She had begun her career as a prosecutor, financial crimes, federal, and had moved to private practice 12 years ago, at which point she had taken everything she knew about how the government dismantles financial fraud and applied it on behalf of clients who had been victimized by it. She was the kind of attorney that other attorneys describe, in the specific language of the profession, as thorough. What this means, I would learn, is that she does not miss things. Not small things, not large things, not the things that seem irrelevant until they are suddenly the pivot point of an entire case. I laid everything on her desk,
the library notes, the printouts of the public records, the partial routing number and the credit union identification, the timeline I had constructed, the photograph of the POA document I had taken with my phone at the county recorder's office. She read in silence for 11 minutes. Then she looked up. "Tell me about the notary," she said. I told her about Gerald Portman, the UPS store address, the charity gala connection to Renata. She wrote something down. "You have documentation of your incapacitation during the period in which the POA was allegedly executed," she said. "Medical records, yes. I was in a coma, intubated, under continuous ICU monitoring. There are nursing logs every 30 minutes for the entire period. Those logs will show you are physically incapable of signing anything." "Correct." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nadia, I want to make sure you understand what we're talking about. This is not a civil fraud matter alone. What you're describing, the forged POA, the notary, the property transfer, these are criminal acts. We are talking about forgery of a legal instrument, fraud in the execution of a real estate transaction, potentially wire fraud given the transfer of funds across financial institutions. These are federal exposure items." "I know," I said. "Your husband's potential involvement, if it can be demonstrated that he was aware or participated in the scheme, extends his exposure similarly." "I know." She looked at me over the rectangular glasses. "Some clients," she said carefully, "prefer to handle these situations civilly. Settlement, restitution, divorce proceedings. It's cleaner, faster." I looked back at her. "I don't want cleaner, I want complete." She almost smiled. "Then here's what we do," she said. The plan, as Margaret Okonkwo constructed it over the following 3.5 weeks, was a thing of practical elegance. I am going to describe it to you in the order it happened, rather than the order it was designed, because that is how justice operates. Not as a blueprint revealed all at once, but as a sequence of dominoes, each falling in the right direction at the right time. The first element was the private investigator. His name was Davis Kern, and he worked exclusively on financial fraud cases, which meant he understood the specific terrain of bank records and corporate filings, and the digital trails that money leaves when it moves through accounts it doesn't belong in. He was laconic in the way that people are laconic when they are very good at what they do and don't need to explain it. He asked me 3 questions in our first meeting, took the documentation I provided, and charged me a retainer that I paid from the business account that Renata had, apparently, overlooked in her inventory of my assets. She had overlooked the business. She had looked at my house and saw $450,000 and stopped looking. She had not looked at Reeves Design Group, which had continued to operate, Delia is extraordinary, during my absence, and which had a business account and a line of credit and a client roster that, if needed, could fund a protracted legal battle. She had not looked far enough. Davis Kern spent 2 weeks looking on my behalf. What he found was this. Renata Clifford had purchased a luxury condominium on Hennepin Avenue, 2 bedrooms, private parking, a building with a concierge and a rooftop terrace for $380,000, cash purchase, closed October 1st. The remaining $70,000 from the wire transfer had been distributed as follows. $25,000 to a personal account in Renata's name at a separate institution, $30,000 to an account in Garrett's name, $15,000 to Gerald Portman in 2 installments, described in Portman's own financial records, which Davis obtained through means he did not specify and which I did not ask about, as professional services rendered.
$15,000. That is what a notary charges, apparently, to commit a federal crime on behalf of a woman with pearl earrings. The $30,000 to Garrett's account was the piece that Margaret described when Davis reported back as the thread. Pull the thread and the whole thing comes apart. Because Garrett receiving funds from the sale of a house he had no legal interest in, a premarital, separately owned asset, constituted either proceeds from a fraud he had participated in or an undisclosed transfer from his mother that had not been disclosed in the divorce proceedings, or both. Either way, it put him in a position that his divorce attorney was going to find extremely difficult to manage. Margaret filed the criminal complaint with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office on a Tuesday. She filed simultaneously with the FBI field office on the grounds of wire fraud. She filed a civil action, fraud, conversion, unjust enrichment, against Renata Louise Clifford, Gerald Portman, and Garrett Reeves. And she obtained on Wednesday morning, before any of the named parties had been served, an emergency asset freeze order covering the condominium, Renata's known accounts, and the routing number ending in 4471. The freeze was granted at 9:47 a.m. At 11:15 a.m., I sat in the parking lot of the Parkway Inn with my oatmeal going cold and watched the timestamp on my phone and thought about Renata in her condominium at that moment, not yet knowing. The police arrived at Renata's building on Thursday at 2 p.m. I was not there. Margaret had advised against it, and she was correct. The footage that a courthouse later reviewed was footage from the building's security cameras, not from a witness, and my presence would have complicated the proceedings. I watched the security camera footage later in Margaret's office on a laptop screen, and what I saw was this: a building concierge who had perhaps begun to understand that his building's newest and most recently arrived resident had created a situation. 2 uniformed officers and a detective in plain clothes. An elevator. A door knocked on with authority. Renata's voice from inside asking who it was. The detective's voice identifying himself. A long pause. The door opening. Renata in the doorway of the condominium she had purchased with my money, wearing her pearls, her face doing something that I would not describe as panic. Panic is too kinetic, too immediate, but the specific expression of a person watching a calculation they believed they had completed correctly reveal an error they cannot now correct. The detective introduced himself. He said, "Miss Clifford, I have a warrant to search this premises in connection with an investigation into fraud in the execution of a legal instrument and wire fraud. I also want to inform you that your accounts have been frozen pending this investigation. Do you have an attorney?" She said something I couldn't hear from the footage. The detective nodded. He said, "I'd advise you to call them now." She went inside to get her phone. The detective waited. The officers waited. I sat in Margaret's office and watched the laptop screen and thought about Renata somewhere beyond the frame, calling an attorney who was going to look at the documentation we had provided and do the math that she had failed to do, which is that between Gerald Portman and the financial records and the nursing logs that proved I was unconscious when the POA was signed, the framework of her plan had no load-bearing walls left. And I thought about Garrett, because his phone was ringing too, and his expression when the attorney called him to explain what was happening was one I would have given a great deal to see in real time. I would see it soon enough.
Gerald Portman lasted 11 days before he flipped. I don't say this with contempt, or not only with contempt. I say it because it is the most important 11 days in the sequence, the hinge on which everything else turned, and I want to give it the weight it deserves. Portman was 63 years old. He had been a licensed notary for 19 years. He had a wife, 2 adult children, and 4 grandchildren whose photographs were, according to the detective who interviewed him, arranged on his desk in the order of their ages, oldest to youngest. He had charged $15,000 to commit a federal crime, which in hindsight was both too much and not nearly enough. Too much to be explained as a misunderstanding, not nearly enough to make the consequences worth it. His attorney, faced with the documentation Margaret had provided, the payment records Davis Kern had located, the timeline placing Portman's notarization of the POA at a time when the alleged signatory was documented to be unconscious in an ICU, made the calculation that his client had 2 options: cooperate fully and negotiate for a reduced sentence, or attempt to defend a position that had no credible defense. He chose cooperation. Portman's statement, provided to both the county attorney and the FBI, described the following. Renata Clifford had contacted him through their mutual acquaintance, the charity connection I had identified at the library, approximately 1 week before the accident. Not after the accident, before. She had explained that her daughter-in-law had a property that needed to be liquidated, that there were personal and financial circumstances that made a standard transaction complicated, and that she needed a notary who could be flexible regarding the documentation. She had used the word flexible in his statement, with the quotation marks audible in his voice, the way people use quotation marks when they are trying to indicate that they know the word was doing work it shouldn't have been asked to do. He had agreed. She had paid him $7,500 up front. She had, according to Portman's statement, brought him a document that was already signed, a POA that bore what she said was her daughter-in-law's signature, and he had notarized it. He said, "She told me the signature was genuine. She said her daughter-in-law had signed it before going into the hospital for a procedure." He said, "I knew the woman was in a coma. I'd read about the accident. I knew the signature couldn't be real." He said, "I notarized it anyway." He said this in a conference room with 2 federal agents, his attorney and a court reporter, and his voice, according to the agent's notes, was the voice of someone who has been carrying something very heavy and has finally put it down, even though the putting down is going to cost him something he cannot get back. The remaining $7,500 had been paid after the closing. With Portman's statement, the criminal case against Renata was, in Margaret's assessment, complete. The forgery was documented, the conspiracy was documented, the financial trail was documented. The fact that it had been arranged before the accident, the premeditation, the planning, this was not an opportunistic act performed in the panic of a daughter-in-law's hospitalization, but a calculated scheme that she began preparing before the accident even occurred, was documented. This detail, the before the accident detail, was the one that changed everything about the sentencing exposure, because premeditation carries weight in criminal proceedings that opportunistic fraud does not. The question of how she had known in advance that an opportunity to liquidate my house might arise is one that the investigation examined and that I have my own answer to, though the answer was never proven to the criminal standard. My own answer is, she didn't. She had been planning a different opportunity, a divorce perhaps, a legal proceeding in which my house would become subject to division, and in which a POA might have been used to force a transaction. The accident had simply moved the timeline forward, and, from her perspective, simplified it. I was going to die. The plan she had prepared in advance of a more complicated execution had become, in August, suddenly straightforward. This is what I mean when I say she had decided that my dying was going to be the clean ending. I had survived, and my surviving had turned her plan into evidence. The civil trial ran on a parallel track. Margaret was managing both simultaneously, the criminal cooperation with the county prosecutors and the civil action for fraud, conversion, and unjust enrichment. The civil action added a cause of action that I want to explain because it is the piece that the court found most satisfying and that the judge, in her written opinion, described in terms that I have since memorized. The conversion of a premarital, separately held asset during the incapacitation of the owner through the use of a fraudulent legal instrument constitutes one of the most egregious violations of the owner's property rights that this court has encountered. The plaintiff was rendered unconscious through no fault of her own, and that incapacitation was exploited by the defendants in a manner that suggests not merely opportunism, but premeditated contempt for the plaintiff's legal rights and physical vulnerability. Premeditated contempt for my physical vulnerability. The judge was a woman named Honorable Carla Dunning, and she had been on the bench for 22 years, and according to Margaret, had seen a great deal and was not easily surprised, and she was surprised by this. The day of the civil hearing, the day the full documentation was presented in open court, the day Renata sat across from me with her attorney for the first time since the fraud had been constructed, was a day I want to describe in specific detail because the details matter. She was wearing the pearls. She was wearing them because she always wore them, because they were armor, because 30 years of wearing them had made them feel like a fact about herself rather than an object she had put on. She was composed when she walked in. She sat at the defense table with the posture of a woman who has decided composure is the best available strategy, and she did not look at me. Her attorney was a man who had not, I think, been provided the full picture of the documentation we had assembled, because as Margaret began presenting, the POA, the nursing logs, the Portman statement, the financial records, the pre-accident timeline, there were several moments that her attorney leaned to speak to her in the low, urgent voice of someone updating information that has just changed significantly. She looked at me once. Approximately 45 minutes into the proceedings, when Margaret was presenting the Portman statement and the sentence, "I knew the woman was in a coma," was read aloud in the courtroom, Renata looked across the room at me. I looked back. I didn't change my expression. I didn't nod. I didn't speak with my eyes in any of the ways people speak with their eyes when they want the other person to understand something. I simply looked back with the particular neutrality of someone who has nothing left to perform. She looked away first. Renata Clifford, who had worn those pearls like a flag for 30 years, who had spent her life managing other people's perceptions of her, who had looked at me in a hospital parking lot 2 months after my accident and offered to help, she looked away first. The hearing lasted 4 days. On the first day, her composure was intact. On the second day, it was managed. On the third day, her attorney filed a motion for recess, citing her client's emotional state. Judge Dunning denied the motion. On the fourth day, her attorney presented a settlement offer. Margaret looked at me across the conference table where the offer was relayed. She said, "It's a number." I said, "Is it the right number?" She said, "No." I said, "Then we continue." Renata began to cry on the afternoon of day 4 during testimony regarding the wire transfer timeline. Not the practiced, managed emotion she had deployed throughout, the dabbed eyes, the compressed lips, the grief that was about the situation rather than the deed. Real crying, the kind that comes when the last strategy fails and there is nothing left to perform. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. She looked at me, and she said, not to the court, not to Margaret, to me, I thought you weren't going to make it." The room went very still. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "I know." And I looked back at the judge. And the proceedings continued.
Garrett's exposure was, in some ways, more straightforward than his mother's. The $30,000 transfer to his account constituted receipt of fraud proceeds. His divorce filing, dated 3 days after my hospitalization, suggested foreknowledge of the plan, an argument his attorney contested and that the court found unproven to criminal standard, but that was nonetheless presented to the jury in the civil proceedings as part of the pattern of conduct. He attempted, through his divorce attorney, to argue that the medical debt I had accumulated prior to our marriage, the hospital bills, the surgical costs, the rehabilitation expenses, should be considered marital debt, given that the marriage had been ongoing when the bills accrued. This argument did not survive contact with Margaret. She presented the evidence that he had filed for divorce 3 days into my hospitalization, which his attorney argued had no legal relevance to the debt question, and which Judge Dunning's ruling addressed with a directness that I appreciated. The court finds that a spouse who files for dissolution of marriage 3 days after a catastrophic accident during the injured spouse's period of incapacitation and who subsequently receives funds from the unauthorized sale of the injured spouse's property cannot in good conscience argue that the medical debts incurred by that injury are a marital liability to be shared. The equities here are not ambiguous. The medical debt remained mine, but the civil judgment against Garrett, his share of the fraud proceeds, plus damages, plus legal costs, exceeded the debt. The net figure, after the judgment was applied, left me whole and left Garrett in a financial position his attorney described in a conference call I was not part of, but that Margaret relayed to me with barely concealed satisfaction as challenging. He had a $30,000 fraud judgment, a civil damages award, a divorce settlement that reflected a court's very low opinion of his conduct, and a professional reputation in a field where reputation is the primary asset. He attempted, through intermediaries, to contact me directly. I did not respond. He sent, through his attorney, an apology. Margaret read it to me over the phone. I said, "File it." She did.
3 years later. I want to give you a Thursday in March, which is the kind of late winter day that can't decide if it's done being winter, that alternates between sunshine and the kind of cold that arrives without warning and makes you realize you have misjudged your coat. I am in my car. I am driving, not to a specific destination, just driving, which is something I do occasionally on Thursday afternoons when I don't have site visits or client meetings, and the week has been the kind of week that benefits from movement. I have a full caseload. Reeves' design group now has 16 employees, which I never entirely anticipated, and a project that was nominated for an industry award last spring, which I entirely anticipated because it was good work done by good people who I hired and retained and have consistently paid well. My house is not on Aldrich Avenue. The Craftsman bungalow on Aldrich Avenue, my Craftsman, the one I restored with my own plans and my own decisions, was legally returned to me as part of the civil judgment. The buyers, the flower apron woman and her husband, were legally innocent parties, and the resolution of their situation was not simple and was not fast, and I feel genuine sympathy for what they went through, which was the innocence version of what I went through, discovering that a transaction they believed was clean was built on a crime they had no part in. They were compensated, eventually, from the fraud proceeds recovered in Renata's accounts.
I sold the house, not because I didn't love it. I loved it the way you love something that has cost you, the way the cost becomes part of the love rather than a subtraction from it. But I had learned in the intervening period that the version of myself who needed that specific house to feel like she had arrived somewhere was a slightly earlier version, and the current version had arrived somewhere else. I bought a different house, a different style, different neighborhood, different light in the afternoons. I am restoring it slowly because I am no longer in a hurry, because I have learned, expensively, specifically, in ways I would not have chosen to learn, that the things worth building are the things you can take your time with. I am driving. I turn onto a street I don't usually take because the Thursday afternoon has the quality of a day that doesn't require efficiency, and efficiency has stopped being the thing I optimize for in every available moment. The street runs past a building I know. It is a city shelter, a clean one. The city has invested in it, the staff is dedicated, the people who pass through it are treated with the dignity that every person in a difficult circumstance deserves. I know these things because I researched the facility after I became aware, through a source I won't name, of who was using it. I am driving past it at approximately 4:15 in the afternoon. The dinner line is beginning. People standing in a line that extends along the building's side. Not a long line, the facility is well staffed enough that the line moves, with the particular body language of people who are cold and tired, and present, not performing anything, not managing anyone's perception of them, simply waiting to eat. I see her. She is smaller than I remember, which is something I did not expect. The pearls are not present. I notice this first somehow, the absence of the pearls, the neck that has worn them so long it seems to carry the memory of them. She is wearing a grey coat that is not a bad coat, not a luxurious one. She is standing in the line with the posture of a woman who is managing something, which is the posture she has always had, but the thing she is managing is different now. The criminal conviction, for which she received a sentence of 20 months with 18 served before conditional release on the grounds of her age and the absence of prior criminal history, had occurred 18 months earlier. The civil judgment had preceded it. The condominium, my $380,000, her walls and her rooftop terrace and her concierge had been seized as fraud proceeds before she was ever sentenced. Her accounts, unfrozen only to the extent necessary to meet the judgment obligations, had been largely liquidated in that process. I am told by the source I won't name that Garrett does not assist her financially because Garrett does not have finances that assist anyone right now. I do not see my car. I drive past. I do not stop. I want to be precise about why. It is not because I am afraid to see her. It is not because I pity her. I feel something in the vicinity of pity, the distant, unsentimental recognition that the life she is living is the consequence of the life she chose, and consequence is not cruelty, even when it looks like it. I do not stop because I have learned in 3 years of rebuilding a life that was taken and reclaimed that the people who wronged me are not my concern anymore. They are their own concern. The shelter is their concern. The consequences are between them and the choices they made. I stopped being their concern the moment I sat in Margaret Okonkwo's office and said, "I want complete." I got complete.
The house on Aldrich Avenue was worth $450,000. The civil judgment, with damages and interest and legal costs, was worth $1.2 million. The damage to my reputation, my health, my sense of safety, the months I spent in the Parkway Inn eating oatmeal at 3 in the morning and listening to the parking lot lights hum, no number covers that. You don't get a number that covers that. You get, eventually, the understanding that the number isn't the point. The point is the freedom of no longer being in it. I'm not in it anymore. I am a 37-year-old woman driving a car on a Thursday afternoon in March with 16 people who work for me, and a house I am restoring slowly, and a cane I no longer use, and a back that is stronger than it was, and a brain that is faster than the neuropsychologist told me to expect. I am a woman who played dead long enough to let her enemies believe they had buried her, and then I came back. Play dead. I want to leave you with one thing. When I woke up in that white room with the heart monitor beeping and the ventilator hissing and Garrett in the chair and the envelope on my chest, the first feeling I had, before the fear, before the anger, before any of the things you would expect, was the feeling of someone who has been underestimated. Not the despair of it, the possibility of it. There is a specific power available to the person who has been dismissed as too damaged to be a threat. I have never experienced a more useful position to operate from than the position of someone who is expected to fold. I did not fold. I am not a woman who folds. If you are in a situation, not this situation probably, but your situation, where someone has decided that your difficulty is their opportunity, I want you to hear this. Play dead if you have to. Keep your receipts, find the right attorney, and when they are not looking because they have decided you are finished, that is the moment you begin.